They've crossed lunar range. That wasn't a relay check. It was a decapitation strike. The words slammed into the war room like a falling steel bulkhead. Commander Ryvan Marka didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every analyst around the Arctic command node froze at their terminals, hands hovering, breath caught mid-inhale. The room's pressure dipped, not physically, but in presence. The scent of thermoplastic console housings and recycled oxygen-filled nostrils, stale from continuous occupancy. Above them, the reinforced ceiling trembled, not from impact, but from the seismic shifting of orbital traffic overhead as systems realigned in complete silence. The status feed to Jupiter Station had cut out 12 minutes prior. What initially appeared as interference from the Ovaran scanning satellites had, upon deeper analysis, shown a targeted pulse wave mapped along known Ovaran engineering patterns, designed specifically to corrupt narrow-beam communication architecture. It wasn't surveillance, it was erasure. Riven's fingers traced across the display, bypassing the official overlays. The public interface still reported auditorial presence within compliance. But below that facade, layered in native root code, was the actual result: 7 major orbital defense contractors marked unreachable. Their transponders had ceased at the same second the lunar relay blacked out. A projection snapped across the side wall, flickering in red edge visibility. Clause 17 activated. They hadn't announced it. Protocol demanded a 3-phase arbitration warning. They bypassed all of it. No arbitration. No summons. No diplomatic channels. Just enforcement. The room didn't gasp. It fell into weighted silence, the kind that wraps itself around bone marrow. "High Council signals live," said the technician beside Marka, her voice dry from rebreather strain. "Geneva's waiting." Ryvan nodded once. He stepped forward into the HoloLink arc as the feed locked in. On the other side, Geneva's chamber, marbled, clinical, domed with natural light reflectors, felt half a galaxy away. Counselor Deneric stood central, arms behind his back, his diplomatic uniform almost ceremonial in its uselessness. His face bore no expression. That, to Marka, was worse than fear. "They've triggered 17 without ceremony," Ryvan said flatly, "and bypassed the protocol for polar platform access. They want to touch Halbert." Deneric answered with the kind of calm only years of enforced diplomacy could cultivate. "And when we declined? The atomized orbital assets. Jupiter Station was the first. Others were struck before our system could reassign ID masking. They're targeting us as a testbed, probing how much we'll let them amputate before we call it war." The chamber fell still, not a cough, not a blink. "They're framing it as a procedural correction," Arik said. "They'll cite Accord sovereignty enforcement under emergency compliance doctrine." Ryvan's jaw tightened. "They're calling it an audit, but it's sterilization." No one replied. On the surface, Earth's re-emergence into the galactic order was a calculated risk. 60 years of chosen blackout following the isothermic collapse had made humanity a myth, a rumor confined to fringe academic journals and cultural xenology. When Earth petitioned the Accord Assembly for observer status, not full membership, it triggered curiosity, then concern, then Clause 17. The clause had been designed centuries ago after the Americ incident, when a fringe species evolved too rapidly and destabilized 3 trade sectors before being forcefully realigned. It allowed any dominant Accord member, like the Ovaran Imperium, to demand a complete systemic audit. Publicly, it ensured peace. In practice, it was a velvet-gloved preemptive disarmament. The Ovaran came under the banner of observation, deploying sleek reconnaissance arrays and legislative envoys, speaking in tones of stability and peace enforcement. But Ryvan had studied them for decades. Their real language was omission. They never said what they would do, only what they had the right to. At first, Earth cooperated. Ground systems were opened, atmospheric satellites decloaked. Commercial pathways laid bare. The Overens scanned, documented, and made polite recommendations, each framed as necessary for interstellar integration. But when they demanded access to the polar defense arc without schedule alignment, authorization chains, or any strategic reasoning, it triggered the hard line. Geneva declined. The Overin didn't argue. They simply removed the limb. Riven broke contact with Geneva and walked the length of the command room. His boots echoed against the grated composite flooring. Every display screen now showed flickers of corrupted telemetry. Surveillance drones in low orbit were vanishing from feeds. Worse, civilian traffic was being rerouted by Overin control systems, under audit restructuring. This wasn't oversight, it was annexation by database. "They think we've forgotten who we are," Riven murmured, almost to himself. "They believe we've traded teeth for titles." A young systems analyst turned, his face pale with realization. "Sir, are we responding?" Riven stopped, considered. The air tasted metallic, laced with sterilizers from the vent systems. He looked up at the live feed from Earth's orbital ring. Patches of debris shimmered like dust around a wound. No broadcasts, no declarations. "We won't scream," Riven said. "That's what they expect." Another operator chimed in, shaking. "Commander, incoming feed from the Imperium envoy, audio only." Riven gestured to route it through. The voice that followed carried no edge, no emotion. It was bureaucratic refinement soaked in centuries of dominance. "As per Clause 17, your compliance threshold has not been met. Assets classified as escalatory have been neutralized in alignment with Accord operational substatutes. Your observer status is under review. Do not interfere with assessment operations." No apology, no justification, just decree. Riven didn't flinch. He turned toward the terminal and input a transmission code. One used only once before, during the Silesian stand. When Earth was seconds from eradication, the message was simple. You have mistaken silence for consent, and tolerance for surrender. No call for war, no threat returned, just clarification. 30 minutes later, strategist Varkal, architect of the Overin enforcement doctrine, stood aboard his flagship and ordered the next stage. Earth, in his mind, had just confirmed it had nothing left to hide. He believed Halbert was unguarded. He believed wrong. Lock the chamber. From this point on, nothing leaves this floor unless I say it does. Commander Riven Marca's voice didn't rise. It dropped. Lower than the steady pulse of command activity around him. Lower than the murmur of analysts still trying to make sense of the data trickling in from Earth's fractured orbit. The effect was immediate. Doors hissed shut with sealed hydraulics. 3 heads turned. Nobody spoke. They knew this wasn't standard procedure. This was legacy protocol. Something older than the uniforms they wore, older than the council they reported to. Marca moved toward the central interface. His boots clicked against reinforced ceramic plating, the only sound now besides the occasional hiss of pressure seals from the data tubes linking the underground node to the outer tracking arrays. He passed a retinal scan without pausing, stepped into the encrypted alcove and inserted the twin keys mounted at his belt. One twisted left, one snapped forward. The console reacted with a low-grade vibration that ran through the soles of his feet and up into his spine. The laser plasma display blinked on, not in color-coded tacticals, but in static gray. One word crawled across the glass, in matte black lettering. "Albert." "Confirm," Marca said, enunciating every syllable. The system paused, then accepted his voice print. With that, Earth's response to the Imperium began. Not with missiles, not with declarations, but with erasure. Across the planet's orbital grid, dormant networks activated, not to fire, but to hide. Civilian transponders flickered as dormant signal packets rode atop them. Commercial satellites adjusted trajectories by imperceptible angles, folding defense telemetry into agricultural forecast packets and cross-hemisphere shipment manifests. Data was no longer stored where it could be found. It was scattered, converted into synthetic mineral scans, seeded through insurance audit logs, and buried in the metadata of millions of outbound banking requests. Military assets didn't vanish, they became unreadable. The Antarctic relay station began feeding falsified transmission pings, tracking Earth's entire defense structure as disarmed, decommissioned, and non-operational. The illusion wasn't cosmetic. It was built from the inside. Earth's own AI governance modules began feeding the Ovaran threat assessment cores with rerouted behavioral algorithms, portraying Earth as unprepared, fractured, and technologically inert. Vector masks are in place, came the announcement from Station 6, tucked into the deep northern crust. Net latencies clean, we're buried. Riva and Marka studied the final feed, an unassuming blurred topographic rendering now being intercepted by every Ovaran war mapping satellite. It showed Earth's orbital ring as empty. Its cloud layer bristled with only commercial traffic and atmospheric cleaning drones. To an alien eye, there was nothing hostile left. He stepped back from the console. They won't strike again. They'll recalibrate. Sir? The youngest operator in the room, barely more than a recruit, leaned forward, her voice cracking from too many hours breathing filtered air. Recalibrate how? They'll send a fleet, Marco replied. Not to attack, to land. The operative blinked. Under what justification? Diplomatic recalibration, Marcus said dryly. They'll call it re-engagement, publicly. Internally, it'll be step 2 in systemic absorption. They think we've collapsed? They think we've folded. Marca turned away from the screen, adjusting the pressure tabs on his jacket. The fabric itched at the collar, woven with smart thread reactive material meant for impact mitigation, not comfort. He was already sweating, though the room held at a steady 15 degrees Celsius, not from heat, but from the weight of what he'd just authorized. He hadn't issued a counterattack. He hadn't mobilized orbital cannons or triggered kinetic barriers. What he'd done was quieter and far more lethal. He'd turned Earth into a blind spot. In the orbit above, the Ovaran fleet repositioned. Their sensor suites pinged clean. Earth's electromagnetic profile reported within standard deviation for a non-escalatory planetary body. As far as the Imperium was concerned, Claw 17 had been executed to compliance. First contact vector detected, said an older voice. Lieutenant Malvec, monitoring from the periphery. Fleet group entering from L5 drift corridor, unarmed configuration, standard diplomatic formation. Of course they were unarmed. The Ovaran didn't bring weapons when they believed enforcement had worked. Marka walked toward the outer feed monitors. The display didn't show ships in battle alignment. It showed delegation craft, surveyors, sensor grid verification units, painted white with high visibility insignia and mission stripes, flags of peace, markers of subjugation. Bring up vector patterning. The heads-up display expanded to full format. Marka traced the spread pattern with 2 fingers. Pause there, he said, pointing toward a seemingly empty quadrant of Earth's sky. Sir, there's no formation in that arc. There will be. He tapped a narrow ring of altitude and position. Adjust our masking grids, give them a clean approach corridor, let them think they're being allowed in. Operators complied without hesitation. Sectors of atmosphere were algorithmically flushed of visual noise. The diplomatic vessels adjusted course, believing, accurately, that they were being granted airspace. Deploy Stage 2 windows, Marcus said quietly. A separate protocol began running deep within the Martian sublayer bunkers and 3 continental supercores far beneath Earth's crust. These weren't weapons. They were atmospheric filtration fields. Mathematical blind zones stitched from gravitational lensing data and feedback mirroring. The Ovaran fleet would see nothing. They would hear nothing. Their instruments would log clear air, but within those gaps, Earth's ghost fleet began to move. From within disguised orbital containers, modular units unfolded silently, adapting into sensor-locked formations. Every piece was cold. No heat signature, no radiation bleed, each frame wrapped in thermal-canceling shells. There were no engines, no visible anchors. They drifted, perfectly inert, until activation. These weren't warships. They were coordinates, each one programmed to create an induced error pocket, brief windows where reality and recognition would misalign. The Ovaran had never seen such a tactic deployed on this scale. They didn't know they were walking into a synthetic blind zone. Marka stared up at the monitor. The enemy ships were already within Earth's orbital perimeter. "They're not hostile," said one of the operators behind him. "They don't need to be," Marka replied. "They're the blade we were supposed to sheathe ourselves with." The lights dimmed by 1 degree. Subtle, but programmed. All consoles now rerouted to halberd control. Global communication lines narrowed to encrypted pulses. Civilian feeds were looped with synthetic data, relaying an illusion of peace, commerce, and normality. "Status?" Marka asked. The reply came from the subcontractor director near the core interface. "All nodes report active. Ghost fields formed. The sky's clean, Commander." Riven Markov didn't speak. He stood at the edge of the command floor, watching Earth's sky fill with diplomatic vessels that didn't yet know they were blind. The trap wasn't made of steel or missiles, it was made of math. And it had already closed. "They're aligning in triform configuration," said Lieutenant Malvek, his eyes tracking the heads-up feed. "Approach arc matches, standard planetary docking posture." Riven Marka didn't look away from the laser plasma display mounted overhead. The enemy fleet was already deep into Earth's upper atmosphere, their vessels moving with the overconfidence of seasoned conquerors. Columns of white-gold delegation cruisers glided along assigned vector paths, artificial gravity pulses shimmering along their dorsal arrays. From a distance, it looked ceremonial. It wasn't. Marka tightened his grip on the side rail, the cold steel bit into his palm, grounding him. He didn't blink as the Ovaran ships drifted farther into mapped ghost zones, mathematically constructed null corridors where perception would diverge from spatial truth. "Halberd synced check," he said. "Triple verified," came the reply from the terminal bank. "False overlay is active. Spectral layering confirmed." "They can't see?" "They're flying into blanks, sir. Every sensor aboard those ships is now lying to them, in a language their systems believe." Marka gave a single nod. "Let's begin." The first incident came with no visual cue, no flash, no warning klaxon. A delegation cruiser abruptly pitched 30 degrees, its artificial stabilizers misreporting gravitational curve data. It rotated along an axis its gyros claimed was flat. The crew, relying entirely on command AI telemetry, didn't react, because the ship's interior readouts confirmed nominal drift. 30 seconds later, a scout vessel clipped the upper stern of that same cruiser. Neither side reported collision warnings. Both ships spun, one into controlled deceleration, the other into roll and yaw confusion. By the time the impact logs were manually reviewed, those records had already been corrupted by Halberd's embedded feedback sequence. On Earth, the command deck was silent. The next domino fell, harder. A full logistics freighter, attempting to stabilize along an adjusted orbital hold, interpreted false vector data transmitted from a sensor relay that didn't exist. The vessel's AI believed it was on the correct approach path. It accelerated into another cruiser's ventral array. The soundless impact lit up Earth's upper sky with an orange streak. Debris fanned outward in uneven arcs, untracked, unsensed, unacknowledged. The Ovaran fleet began broadcasting distress signals, then, seconds later, looped those same messages back into their own relay grid. Comms are folding inward, said the tech nearest to Marka, brow furrowed. They're talking to themselves. Intentionally? Asked Malvek. Marka answered, still calm. Halberds built to mimic familiarity. Their systems are built to trust redundancy, so we gave them more of it. The feed displayed more instability. A mapping frigate blinked out of standard relay position, only to reappear 3 seconds later, 4 degrees off-axis, navigating with an outdated gravitational profile. Collision alarms cascaded on board, conflicting with inertial dampener inputs. The crew responded by issuing counter-adjustments. Halbert inverted the outputs. Within 90 seconds, the ship was caught in its own feedback spiral, interpreting the wrong course correction as verified trajectory. It sideswiped a data frigate, sheared 2 relay fins, and dropped into a free-fall spin. No one had fired. No Earth drone had moved. The enemy fleet was falling apart, sabotaged not by weaponry, but by belief. Marka stepped forward. Inject visual ghosting. The command was relayed instantly. From within Earth's upper sky, hidden projectors beamed false thermal signatures, matching Overin fleet profiles, but moving along mirrored paths. To the Imperium's eyes, it appeared that rogue vessels were maneuvering out of formation. Confused captains began issuing threat-level upgrades. Some activated shielding protocols. A few even fired light-burst suppressors, only to strike phantom echoes or hit themselves during misaligned projectile tracing. The destroyer-class command ship ejected a drone swarm as failsafe defense. The drones locked onto corrupted IFF tags, mistook Allied cruisers for hostiles, and engaged with subkinetic rounds. The upper cloud layer flashed in rapid bursts, none of them visible to Earth's civilian population below, but on the deck the feed was crystal clear. Status on collision index? Marka asked. 13, came the operator's voice. 2 total losses. 4 out of formation. 1 venting without recovery. They still don't know? They're not fighting us, Commander. They think the malfunction is theirs. Marka stepped back. Issue the signal. The communication officer toggled the relay buffer, entered the command string, and activated the outbound line. There was no broadcast fanfare. Just a narrow-beam message, locked to the Ovarin flagship, encrypted to their native military lexicon, and stripped of all human linguistic nuance. Withdraw Class 17. Leave orbit. No further statement will follow. The words arrived on Varkal's bridge minutes later, displayed on a wraparound command canopy inside a temperature-stabilized deck built to withstand direct neutron exposure. He read it once, then again. He didn't react with panic or suspicion. He smiled. The expression chilled his advisors. Finally, he said, standing slowly, they remember who's in charge. A captain approached, his tone cautious. Sir, collision reports are growing. We've lost positional synchronization across 5 subchains. Varkal didn't even glance at the data cluster. They're buying time, creating chaos to bait sympathy. A wounded predator flailing in its last act. He rotated toward the command array. Bring forward the Polar Defense Arc targeting package. One of the deck operators hesitated. We haven't been granted kinetic clearance. Varkal's eyes narrowed. They issued a refusal of clause compliance. They answered oversight with trickery. I'm escalating this to level 4. Reinforcement. We purge the polar ring. We send a message. Understood. Orders were given. Above Earth, 5 kinetic warheads slid from their containment units. Black casings lined with thermal dispersers to bypass mid-orbit detection. They adjusted trajectory, flattening vectors toward the polar cap with steady deceleration to mask orbital re-entry. Marka received the alert in under a second. They've committed, said Malvek. Polar Strike Group has cleared drop silence. They're headed for Halberd Shell. Marka didn't blink. He tapped a new key string, one kept separate from every other command issued today. A black-paneled authorization line opened along his display. He placed his palm against it. Morvain protocol, prepare for insertion. The air in the room shifted, not physically, but in tone. For the first time since the fleet arrived, no one spoke. The ghosts were about to meet the ones who made them. "They're almost here," said Lieutenant Malvec, eyes locked on the vertical descent paths threading across the heads-up interface. "Impact in 21 seconds. The polar arc feed pulsed with real-time trajectories. 5 kinetic projectiles sleeved in ceramic dispersal shells burned across Earth's stratosphere. Their speed didn't read as alarming. That was by design. Slow entry gravity sliders didn't trigger high-elect protocols unless flagged. Earth had declined to flag them. That choice wasn't an oversight. Ryvan Marka didn't step forward. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't need to. The moment the feed registered suborbital breach, the embedded terminal at his right hand bloomed into life. The air chilled inside the control room, not due to atmospheric shift, but from the silent recognition that the fallback line had just activated. "Mark it," Marka said. The controller tapped twice on the laser plasma display. 3 tiny markers appeared on the orbital map, each one disguised beneath outdated registry codes identifying them as asteroid resource haulers. Civilian class, engine cycled, flagged for automated drift protocol. To the Overend fleet, they were detritus. They were not. "Morvain is live," whispered the comms officer. From their concealed entry vectors, the 3 vessels slipped beneath the formation pattern of the dreadnought cluster. No alerts triggered. The mining ships weren't new. They were ancient, cold drift models, repurposed and gutted decades ago. What they now carried wasn't mineral harvesting tech. Each was retrofitted with zero-impact boarding arms, insulated hull clamps, and folded segment docking claws tuned to link with old-style maintenance ports on Imperium flagship cores. The connection didn't spark. It didn't trigger vibration. It was clean, quiet, deliberate, built to simulate aging structure expansion rather than intrusion. Then came the deployment. Teams moved without word or light. 8 men per vessel, uniforms blacked out, pulse gear nested in vacuum foam. They weren't warriors. They were interruptions in cause and effect, trained to enter, disrupt, and vanish without recoil. Each operative carried only 3 tools: a null-wave disruptor tuned to hijack local AI processing layers, a synaptic loop module designed to target central nervous recognition, and a thermal inertial cloak, masking body presence from biometric filters. The first insertion point was the dorsal bridge access of Varkal's secondary command carrier. The access hatch opened with a whisper, and the operatives filtered inside, like heat fading through stone. Inside the ship, corridors were dim. Bridge crew sat at monitoring posts, unaware. There was no tension. The fleet still believed Earth had fired nothing. Dealed. The NS moved through the auxiliary ladder channels, bypassing security nodules entirely. Onboard monitors still reported green. There had been no entry alert. No power disruption. No movement beyond what the Imperium's own algorithms had learned to ignore. The first man to fall never made a sound. He slumped forward over his console, eyes open, pupils dilated. The loop protocol didn't kill. It locked the brain in a recursive feedback pattern. It hijacked the subject's short-term recall, forcing it to repeat the last successful thought chain indefinitely. From the outside, it appeared as simple disorientation. In reality, the officer's consciousness had short-circuited, burning through itself like a skipped record stuck on a corrupted loop. Within 45 seconds, the command deck had ceased functioning, not due to sabotage, but because every living officer was trapped inside their own minds, running thoughts they'd already finished, unable to progress past recognition. The CNS squad didn't break stride. Second and third insertions followed within 90 seconds. Each team split once aboard, targeting structural control nodes first. Environmental systems, AI feedback layers, heat regulation bays. In every case, the CNS operatives bypassed direct engagement. They walked through hallways, passing crew that didn't even know they were there, Masked body temperatures, tuned audio step silencers, and field nullification layers made them functionally invisible in every sensor field the Imperium used. The command trees collapsed before alarms could even attempt to reach vocal range. Back inside Arctic Command, Marka observed it all unfold from a collapsed node interface, flicker-fed telemetry relayed through quantum-timed bursts. He watched heat maps vanish from the dreadnoughts, one by one. Central Command readouts blinked to black. Artificial gravity inside one flagship fluctuated as automated failsafes kicked in without understanding why their operators had ceased giving input. "Command tree is gone," said the analytics lead. "Varkal has no chain left." "Has he noticed?" Marka asked. "His personal feed's live. He's been re-entering fallback command codes for 70 seconds. Nobody is confirming." Inside Varkal's command chamber, the strategist's lips were drawn tight, jaw clenched so hard the veins in his neck stood out. His attendants were unresponsive, still breathing, still upright, but cognitively erased from the structure of command. He didn't know why. He didn't know how. He did know something else. He had one final safeguard. With shaking fingers, Varkal activated the subdeck ignition trigger beneath his console, protected behind encrypted access plates, coded to his biosignature alone. It unlocked a final subroutine built not for war, but for erasure. The Earth-Mars orbital belt had long served as humanity's outer shell. Communications, relays, civilian station hubs, and modular research pylons. All of it vulnerable, all of it cataloged by over- and long-range mapping decades ago. If he couldn't claim victory, he could strip Earth of its interplanetary reach. "Authorize failsafe detonation," he said, sweat pooling across the rim of his eyebrows. "Engage sequence." The bridge confirmed the order to him with a soft internal ping. Outside, buried beneath northern tundra and submerged into the volcanic shelf off the Kerguelen Trench, 6 Terra silos came online. They didn't light up. They simply activated. Each silo, disguised as deep earth mining stations, legally protected by Accord commercial treaties, extended launch rails upward into embedded substrata, ejection chambers. No one outside Earth had ever seen them fire. Inside command, the launch operator didn't wait for the signal to complete its arc. Target lock acquired. Trajectory uplinks synced. "Disengage inhibition sequence," Marka ordered. Firing. 6 interceptors broke atmosphere 30 seconds after Varkal's failsafe code reached orbital signature. They did not aim for impact points. They did not carry warheads. Instead, each was coded to track ignition residue, the unique thermal bloom of a failsafe ignition path. They moved faster than over-and recognition cycles. Varkal, watching his countdown readout tick toward ignition, didn't understand why it stopped at 0.6 seconds. He stared at it. It didn't complete. It stayed there, frozen. He stood up, half hoping the console was malfunctioning. It wasn't. Earth had caught the strike before it could be born. And now, his fleet didn't respond. His voice echoed in a chamber full of bodies that couldn't hear him. Then the power dimmed. Not from failure, from isolation. "They never saw the ignition," said Malvek, eyes narrowed at the targeting pane. "That's why it failed." His voice cut across the Arctic command deck with the kind of weight that followed after finality. Everyone around him stood locked in place. No alarms, no red lighting, no need to shout. Just a slow realization settling across every operator as their displays updated and froze simultaneously. On the primary heads-up interface, 6 vapor trails stitched their way across upper atmospheric bands. Suborbital interceptors had exited their silos just seconds ago, launched not in response to impact but to intent. Their guidance systems were not programmed to follow heat signatures or trace object trajectories. They were coded to pursue the one thing Overend doctrine never accounted for: decision weight. Each missile fed directly off command architecture bleed, chasing the unique microfriction left behind in the sub-ion layer when an ignition order was born and transmitted. It wasn't targeting material. It was chasing choice. And now, That choice had nowhere left to land. "The strike vector is gone," said the trajectory analyst. "It didn't malfunction, it was erased." The laser plasma display now showed only residual static at the ignition zone, an empty pocket of sky that no longer contained a threat. The failsafe had been severed mid-birth, the command string scorched before it could deploy into kinetic form. Varkal's most protected weapon had never left theory. "Unpacked avoidance grid confirmed," said the control technician beside Marka. "No debris, no cascade, we're clean." Marka didn't react. His eyes remained locked on the flight map. "Shift to capture protocol. Begin threading pass." Colors pivoted immediately. Below the station, signal towers tuned into magnetic threading vectors, a method developed decades earlier in theoretical tests involving orbital salvage. It had never been used on a live target. It had never been tested against something that still had crew aboard. It was never intended to be. The flagship's outer structure glided over the hemisphere, its hull scorched along the aft sector where escape boosters had misfired in panic. No counterthrust, no shielding response, no active escort. It was drifting. Consciousness severed, autonomy lost. A ship built for domination, now silenced from within. 4 atmospheric anchors were already rising from synchronous towers across Earth's surface. Each one folded open with quiet hydraulic force, launching thin field threading arms upward. Not cables, not beams, but compressed magnetogravity braids, tuned to lock onto ion-bonded hull plating. Once all 4 made contact, the threads latched and held. Tension readings spiked. Tower supports groaned under load as the structure braced against orbital drift weight. The vessel resisted slightly, its mass fighting the pull, but there was no correctional burn, no pilot maneuver. "They're not resisting," said Malvek, voice steady now. "Deadstick capture confirmed." Marka stepped forward. "Lower altitude, lock it over equatorial band 42 clicks." The flagship began descending, slowly, deliberately. From cities scattered across the globe, civilians looked upward. A dark mass, sun-etched and vaguely smoking, crept across the daylight sky like a second moon carved into fragments. No announcements had gone out. No media broadcasts had been triggered. There was no need. The dreadnought's shape was unmistakable. The Imperium's flagship, known from every Accord file and Doctrine archive, was now floating above Earth like a monument of refusal. The very weapon meant to enforce dominance had become an anchor of shame. Inside the Arctic node, power levels stabilized. "Threading complete," the operator confirmed. "Vessel locked in geosynchronous hold, no thruster output. Command systems remain non-responsive." Marka walked past his terminal, approaching the central platform ring. For the first time since Halberd was deployed, he allowed his shoulders to settle. His steps echoed against the plated floor as he made his way to the observation pane, overlooking the outer array. Where the sky, clear unmarred, framed the silent colossus overhead. "Was this necessary?" Malvek asked quietly, joining him. "Would they have stopped otherwise?" Marka replied. Malvek didn't answer. Behind them, the laser plasma display rotated feeds, the disabled Overend cruisers still tumbling in upper orbit, the scattered debris of friendly fire incidents between Imperium vessels, the failed ignition trigger now permanently flagged as non-recoverable. And at the center of it all, suspended by human threading towers, was the vessel that once bore strategist Varkal's seal. Now stripped of crew, stripped of purpose, and held in place like a tombstone over the only line Earth had drawn. Marka turned to the comms console. The comms officer waited. "New message," Marka said. The officer hesitated. "Sir, we don't send anything." He stepped away, returning to the rear of the command deck. The silence wasn't tactical anymore. It had transformed into policy. There would be no triumph music, No global transmission claiming victory, no political speech summarizing courage or retribution. The Ovaran fleet had written its own ending. Earth had merely refused to participate. Outside, the sky held the image steady, a crippled flagship darkened against the sun, tethered like a myth taught too many times and finally corrected. The war hadn't ended with fire. It had ended when Earth made reality disagree with the enemy's assumptions. And that, Ryvan Marka knew, would be remembered far longer than any explosion. Let the dreadnought hang, let the orbit hold. It wasn't a prize. It was a line. Begin lockdown red, Commander Ryvan Marka ordered. And with that sentence, the final operation began. Without banners, without sirens, and without a single broadcasted word. The command didn't ripple through the room. It settled into the operators like a change in weather. Systems went quiet by design. Workstations dimmed to low power mode, and the Arctic Control Center shifted from active engagement to containment. Lights retracted inward, casting longer shadows across the reinforced chamber. No one clapped. No one exhaled in relief. They were trained not to. On the central laser plasma display, the Ovaran fleet's remaining vessels drifted like relics, disarmed, uncrewed. Some spun slowly, having lost internal balance after command collapse. Others floated locked in parallel to Earth's axis, frozen in coordinated default. A posture meant to signal surrender, but no signal had come. Earth hadn't requested it. Recovery teams dispatched, said the systems lead. Override packages delivered to all remaining Imperium vessels. Their AI subsystems are offline. We're clean. Marka didn't nod. He glanced at the auxiliary readout. Command codes validating full deactivation across 37 ships still inside Earth's local orbit. None had returned fire. None had broadcast queries. What remained of the fleet had functionally ceased to exist. Memory cords? He asked. Unlinked and scrubbed, replied a woman near the main console. We used salt wave chaining to fragment their active state logs. Navigation registries have been overridden with solar drift data. Make it permanent. In orbit, the first tow lines locked onto the hull of an Imperium observation ship. Drones from Earth's Deep Space Salvage Division, modified construction units from mining sectors, reflagged for silent cleanup, pulled the vessel slowly, methodically, toward a waiting orbital gate near the Earth-Luna anchor point. The gate blinked green, pulsed once, and spun open. Destination, Neptune, Arc 7. It wasn't a prison. It wasn't a battleground. It was a graveyard, engineered for forgotten hardware, solar drift salvage, and now, strategic obscurity. One by one, Ovaran ships passed through the corridor. No lights, no escort, each stripped of memory, purpose, and autonomy. They exited Earth's sphere of influence not by force, but by quiet dismissal. In Geneva, the High Council chamber remained shuttered. No global addresses were planned, no celebratory session scheduled. The civilian population had seen the dreadnought above them, yes, but the lockdown on all military channels meant the story that followed would come late, if at all. Earth's choice was clear. Control the truth not by shaping it, but by subtracting it. Inside the secure transfer vault beneath command, Marcus stepped into a secondary chamber lit by low-band spectrum panels. One large workstation stood at the center, surrounded by verification ports and timing locks. This was where it would be compiled. Not a speech, not a presentation, but a single digital artifact. He keyed in access. The screen unfolded with line after line of raw telemetry. Halberg's overlays, Morvain logs, Polar Victor interceptor footage, failure state breakdowns of the failsafe weapon, and the captured data of the flagship threading operation. It wasn't edited. There were no time gaps, no altered frequencies. Earth hadn't doctored anything. Encrypt every packet, Marcus said, stepping back as the first stage of assembly ran. Use V-lattice protocols. Direct accord transmission lines only. Single route push. Yes, Commander, came the filtered voice from behind the hardened glass. He turned to the wall mount panel and began recording his own contribution. Not a monologue, just annotation, context for those reviewing the feed. His tone remained clinical, calm. Directive summary, he stated. Clause 17 triggered without procedural alignment. Earth responded with protocol containment. All countermeasures documented, no extraplanetary assets involved. Final engagement state resulted in full neutralization without retaliatory destruction. Target identity confirmed as High Strategist Varkal. Flagship status held in geostationary position for evidentiary validation. Validate? He paused, and then added, Earth does not seek retribution. This record is submitted under Article 4, Contextual Audit Disclosure. We will answer questions. We will not offer explanation. The screen timed out after transmission confirmation. The dossier would reach the Accord Assembly within a day. Transmitted through compressed encryption bundles routed via Mars' deep relay and bounced through Saturn's shadow gate to prevent interference or interception. The information wasn't debatable. It wasn't inflammatory. It was irrefutable. Sir, came Malvik's voice through the private channel. Media channels are starting to pick up the orbital images. They're asking for statements. Marka didn't sit. Don't give them any. They'll start pulling their own conclusions. They're supposed to. He exited the transmission vault and walked back into main ops. Outside, on every display, the dreadnought remained fixed in its silent orbit, held aloft by invisible anchors, casting shadows that drifted along the oceans beneath it. Weather systems curved around its mass, flight paths rerouted subtly. Cities shifted their observatory windows to avoid its silhouette. It wasn't celebrated. It wasn't denied. It simply was present, undeniable and deliberately unspoken. Marka looked out through the east-facing observation window. Clouds moved low across the ice plains. No contrails, no sirens, no searchlights. Just the quiet reordering of authority. The kind of ending that didn't look like victory. The kind that rewrote how power was measured. Varkal's identifier from the command archive. Effective immediately, said Curator Ralvin of the Tesh Assembly, her voice clipped with a formality sharpened by embarrassment. The room did not erupt, it simply updated. Terminal screens adjusted with quiet compliance across the chamber. On the right wall, where a database of Interstellar command registries shimmered in alternating script bands, Varkal's name dissolved from line 0, 41 Alpha, his record replaced by a neutral slate, tagged, redacted. Governance violation under review. No explanation, no defense file. Not even a note for historical analysis? The Overend delegation did not speak. 3 of them sat along the forward crescent, their robes neatly pressed, faces composed, but every gesture now held in check, as though to speak would risk legitimizing their fall. They hadn't returned to the assembly floor to make a case. They were present because protocol demanded witness. Earth's submission had arrived 72 hours prior. It contained no summary statement, no diplomacy, just data. Telemetry, chain of command collapse indicators, real-time orbital footage, time-stamped fleet degradations, Morvain logs and communication denials recorded without distortion. Nothing dramatized, nothing withheld, no preamble, no plea. Now the assembly chamber shifted. 5 Accord nations, each historically aligned with the Overend Imperium, had filed revocation documents. Not hostile withdrawal, not condemnation, merely detachment. Each claimed their treaties lacked foundational alignment under new operational realities. Each withdrew economic, security, and orbital support from Imperium channels. Diplomacy reframed as silence. Ambeline strategist, Ambassador Kor Dench, stood at the chamber's eastern podium, posture erect, voice neutral. Having reviewed Earth's disclosure, my government concludes that the implementation of Clause 17 violated 4 internal thresholds. 1. Activation without alert. 2. Targeted disruption without civilian notice. 3. Structural overrides issued in peacetime. 4. The deployment of force without assembly review. He paused, blinking once. The Earth did not retaliate. It documented. Its defense mechanisms were dormant unless trespassed. What followed was not warfare, it was system containment. His final phrase held weight, delivered with measured rhythm but no theatrical tone. He sat down. From the eastern tier, a delegate from the mirror axis leaned forward, tapping her data panel. Our analysts have confirmed the term internally compromised applies to the surviving Overend fleet structure. Breakdown occurred without active external engagement. Based on forensic telemetry, crew autonomy ceased due to internal feedback collapse. That qualifies as systemic failure under Article 9. An updated designation flickered across the laser plasma status ring in the assembly hall's center. Imperium Strike Fleet designations. Status: internally compromised. The label wasn't punitive, it was bureaucratic. A quiet reassignment of identity from dominant actor to deprecated asset. The implications were irreversible. From the far side of the chamber, a Salkari envoy, known for rarely engaging, spoke through his translator shell. A civilization that defends without overt engagement has altered the ratio of threat to intent. The Earth has not demanded anything. This is instructive. The line triggered murmurs. Not arguments, adjustments. By the 4th hour, the Assembly's posture had shifted entirely. No longer centered on containment or investigation, the dialogue bent toward insulation. How to preserve interstellar order after the Imperium's collapse of standing. Recommendations for restructuring patrol routes were submitted. Trade agreements previously processed through Overend diplomatic arms were flagged for reevaluation. The Imperium was not dissolved, it was reorganized around absence. In Geneva, the Earth Council reviewed the external feeds. No delegate from Earth had yet stepped into the assembly floor. That was by design. The transmission had been enough. Earth had made its case in a single act, submission of facts without accompanying judgment. No ambassador had traveled. No representative had lobbied. Not a single call was placed to request favor or absolution. And yet, the consequences played out on screens across the planet like a procedural sunset. On rooftops, civilians watched the tethered dreadnought shift its orbit slightly to accommodate atmospheric stability modeling. It cast an arc of shadow across the Pacific, moving slowly across ocean and continent alike, its blackened hull now streaked with condensation and thermal decay. A structure once used to intimidate planetary systems, now circled like a captive relic. Children asked what it was. Adults didn't answer. The symbol spoke on its own. In the Accord chamber, the final motion of the day was quiet. One representative, a retired tactical analyst from the Partheni sector, stood from his seat and addressed the assembly. Historically, we feared Earth for its unpredictability. We isolated it. Then we authorized its audit. The result is before you. He looked up at the central pillar feed. Earth responded to Clause 17 not with retaliation, but with consequence. This assembly must now ask, which is more dangerous, a species that strikes in anger or one that responds through omission? A stillness followed. Then, a final motion, request for a closing statement, Earth. The council clerk recorded it. A diplomatic relay was activated. The request transmitted through standard channels. Geneva acknowledged receipt. Revan Marka read it from his operations chamber. He didn't smile. He simply leaned forward and said, "I'll answer it myself." And with that, Earth prepared to speak once, only once, to a galaxy that had never known restraint as its final verdict. "Are you carrying a statement?" The question met Commander Revan Marka 3 steps past the outer ring of the Accord assembly chamber. The clerk, dressed in layered administrative silver, looked directly at him but offered no gesture of greeting. Protocol didn't require one. Not today. Marka didn't slow. "No written submission." The clerk blinked. Then you'll speak live? I'll speak once. He continued down the corridor, boots steady against polished corium tile, footsteps echoing off the vaulted architecture designed to impress galactic unity. The passage widened ahead, flanked by security drones and ceremonial guards in neutral colors, none of whom moved. No one escorted him, none announced his arrival. This wasn't a trial. This wasn't a hearing. This was procedural. Earth's response to a formal inquiry logged following the Clause 17 incident. It was supposed to be diplomatic. It wouldn't be. Inside the main hall, light shifted to accommodate his entrance. Every attending envoy had already taken position in their assigned tiers. 2,000 seats arranged in ascending arcs around a central speaking ring. Banners of every Accord nation hung in still air above them, undisturbed. The feed on the central heads-up display no longer showed Earth's tethered dreadnought. That image had been archived. Now it simply cycled between orbital telemetry and the recorded delivery manifest Earth had sent 3 days earlier. No Earth delegation had spoken since. Until now. As Marka crossed the threshold, motion sensors embedded in the marble casing activated the spotlight grid. It followed him without fanfare. His uniform remained unadorned. The only symbol visible was the Polaris Institute seal above his chest, a faded black spiral with nothing inside. 1,000 eyes followed him, but none spoke. He reached the center. Silence held. Not out of courtesy, but out of calculation. The assembly expected a warning, perhaps a justification. At minimum, they anticipated some attempt at decorum. Even the Ovaran remnants, now relegated to back-seating with no voting right, looked on with veiled curiosity. Marka adjusted the wrist loop of his coat and lifted his head. "You filed for review," he said, voice steady, broadcast through the chamber's layered audio system without modulation. "You requested a response." He turned once, slowly, to meet the full circumference of the assembly. No teleprompter guided him. He read nothing. He waited until the last echo dissipated. Earth declined to be judged. We chose instead to submit documentation, not because we sought punishment, not because we feared correction, but because your clause triggered the wrong assumption, that tolerance is indefinite. A few diplomats shifted uncomfortably. "You called it an audit," he continued, "so we gave you results, not a performance, not a defense, a record of your methodology, your outcome, and your failure to understand what our silence meant." He stepped closer to the primary projection plate, built from reinforced stone mined on the Carson moons, designed to absorb vibration and allow resonance through natural acoustic diffusion. "You didn't find weapons. You found restraint. You didn't provoke defense. You provoked consequence. Not vengeance, not escalation, just the end of assumption." He paused long enough for the next row of delegates to recognize the weight behind the structure of each sentence. "You expected demand," Marka said. "You came looking for threat. You hoped for noise. You found neither." He looked toward the high platform where the core triumvirate sat, the Vashka envoy with its translator dome retracted, the Theron ambassador cross-legged and unmoving, and the Koran chair leaning forward ever so slightly, waiting. "You want to understand what happens next?" Marka said. "You believe there's a doctrine coming, an ultimatum, a shift in posture. That would be your way." He shook his head once. "That's not how we speak." A light pressure moved through the room, like a mass exhale no one wanted to acknowledge. Nobody interrupted. None reached for discussion tablets. The entire gallery sat in still readiness. Marka's next words arrived without tempo change, but with finality embedded in the structure of tone. "You got your audit." He waited. One heartbeat. One full breath. That was your last chance. And then he turned. He walked away from the center ring without invitation to stay, without request to clarify, without permission to offer more. The lights didn't dim. The security didn't escort. He retraced his steps back across the ceremonial stone, past the banners, past the clerk, who didn't speak again. He exited the chamber. Inside, no one followed. Above Earth, the captured dreadnought still orbited, tethered, burned, suspended between rotation points that ensured its visibility from every hemisphere over a 24-hour cycle. Its engines cold, its identity stripped, its history etched into Earth's atmospheric logs, not as war, but as correction. 3 days later, Klaus 17 was officially retired by unanimous assembly vote. The record labeled it as inoperative under sovereign conflict parameters, retired for cause. No debate was logged, no discussion posted. The galaxy understood. They had issued an audit. Earth had answered, and Earth had nothing further to say. What would you have done in Earth's place? Strike first, or wait until the last line was crossed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you felt the weight of every word Earth didn't say, hit that subscribe button for more stories.